Winter didn't nearly wipe out early humans because of the cold. It nearly wiped them out because they kept trying ideas that made the cold angrier. And if you think freezing to death was the worst outcome, oh no. Things get much dumber from here. 1. Watching a clan of early settlers proudly march into a blizzard wearing nothing but layers of wet animal hides is a masterclass in confidence defeating intelligence. They dunked the skins in water first, convinced the moisture would freeze into armor, as if becoming a human ice sculpture was a tactical upgrade. The result was exactly what nature ordered. Instant cryo people shuffling around like poorly carved lawn ornaments while insisting the cold couldn't get through the glaze. Their big survival insight was essentially turning themselves into frosted pastries, and yet they persisted, boasting that the shiny finish made them more aerodynamic. Nothing says winter preparedness quite like voluntarily transforming into a popsicle and calling it strategy. 2. Watching a medieval village solve frostbite by warming their feet directly over open flames is the kind of medical logic that makes you wonder whether the ice or the ignorance was deadlier. People would hover their frozen toes over fire pits like they were toasting marshmallows, fully believing numb extremities needed the same treatment as camp snacks. The only problem, which really should have been obvious, was that toes don't warn you they're burning when they're already frozen. So villagers proudly walked away thinking they'd mastered the cold, unaware they were now smuggling charred digits inside their boots. It was the perfect collision of optimism and biology, resulting in a treatment plan best described as frostbite meets barbecue. 3. Seeing ancient hunters smear themselves with bear fat wei xiu to borrow the creature's winter strength is exactly the kind of thinking that proves evolution is just a very patient referee. They would lather themselves like rotisserie chickens, believing predators would view them as honorary bears instead of discounted appetizers. Nature, of course, had other opinions. Smelling like a mobile snack cart in carnivore territory turned out to be catastrophically bad camouflage. Bears, wolves, mountain cats, everyone showed up like it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. Somehow, the technique remained popular for centuries, probably because those who realized it didn't work were too busy being eaten to share their feedback. 4. Watching Norse farmers combat freezing winds by building wind tunnels. Around their houses is a bold strategy, considering wind tunnels. Amplify wind. They barricaded their homes with angled wooden structures designed to redirect the icy breeze, which they did, straight into their front doors at twice the speed. Families would huddle inside while their handmade winter enhancement blasted snow through cracks with the enthusiasm of a possessed leaf blower. And yet, they kept insisting the design worked because the theory sounded scientific enough. It turns out you don't need meteorology when you've got confidence in lumber, both of which they had in concerning abundance. 5. Witnessing a remote mountain community deal with blizzards by hammering metal plates under their shoes. Makes it abundantly clear no one had tested the physics. Their logic: metal is strong, so metal feet must be stronger in snow. What they invented instead was the earliest, least intentional ice skating league. People shuffled across frozen terrain like newborn giraffes on buttered cookie sheets, insisting the sliding was part of the plan. The only thing these metal soles truly strengthened was the local emergency storytelling tradition, which had no shortage of citizens who gracefully skated straight into rivers, fences, livestock, and occasionally each other. 6. Observing medieval monks maintain winter warmth by locking themselves in tiny stone rooms with a single candle. Showcases the impressive power of faith to override thermodynamics. They believed the candle's flame symbolized divine heat, and that the body would warm itself out of respect. Meanwhile, physics continued not caring. The temperature inside those chambers dropped so low the candle was often the only thing that hadn't frozen. But monks, ever committed, insisted they felt spiritually warm, which is exactly the kind of statement you make when your physical senses have given up and moved on. Spiritual enlightenment, achieved primarily through accidental refrigeration. 7. Seeing ancient soldiers rub snow on their exposed skin. As a training technique to toughen themselves against the cold is an Olympic-level demonstration of macho bravado overriding basic survival. They'd stand shirtless in sub-zero temperatures, massaging themselves with handfuls of ice like they were preparing a salad, convinced this ritual would make them immune to winter. What it made them immune to, mainly, was long-term circulation. The commanding officers praised the ones who didn't collapse, assuming those were the strongest, not realizing they were just the ones who hadn't noticed their limbs shutting down yet. A triumph for morale, a tragedy for biology. 8. Watching Arctic explorers rely on warm alcohol baths. For survival is the kind of decision that perfectly sums up human priorities. Cold outside, booze inside, problem solved. Unfortunately, the alcohol they used evaporated faster in freezing air, chilling them further, while the intoxication made them feel warmer, right up until they passed out in snowbanks like extremely poorly placed decorations. Their journals often praise the invigorating heat of these baths, which is a poetic way of saying they were too drunk to notice the cold escalating from discomfort to medical emergency. Winter won, but at least everyone died with rosy cheeks. 9. Seeing medieval shepherds endure storms by stuffing straw directly into their clothing. Demonstrates the universal human belief that if something works for livestock, it must work for people too. They jammed hay under their shirts until they looked like disgruntled scarecrows, convinced insulation was just a matter of volume. Technically, straw can insulate, if arranged carefully. But these shepherds were working with the just shove it in there method, which mostly created drafts, itching, and occasional haystack fires when someone wandered too close to a torch. But as long as the sheep survived winter, they took it as proof the strategy was flawless. 10. Watching early Siberian villagers attempt to survive winter by sleeping directly on heated stones. Proves that even good ideas can be catastrophically misunderstood. The correct method, from cultures that actually mastered it, is to place insulation between the hot stone and the human body. These villagers skipped the insulation, turning bedtime into a slow roast. People would boast about drifting off atop the warm heart of the earth, only to awaken with scorched clothing, singed dignity, and occasionally the imprint of a rock baked into their skin. Shockingly, they never blamed the technique, only the poorly chosen stones. 11. Witnessing a northern tribe battle blizzards by painting their bodies with white clay, so the snow wouldn't see them, is a glorious intersection of creativity and complete misunderstanding of the enemy. They treated winter like a sentient predator with vision problems, believing camouflage would prevent the cold from finding them. What it actually prevented was anyone else finding them, because white-on-white camo is excellent at disguising frozen people who've collapsed mid-March. Entire groups vanished into the landscape, forcing search parties to walk around poking suspicious snow lumps with sticks like they were hunting for misfiled laundry. 12. Seeing medieval sailors fight hypothermia by wrapping themselves in salted cloth. Demonstrates the impressive power of tradition to persist despite zero evidence. They believed salt held heat and would lock warmth into their bodies. In reality, salt absorbs moisture, meaning their thermal wraps became cold, wet, briny torture devices within minutes. Sailors waddled across decks like underseasoned turkeys, convinced the sting meant it was working. Meanwhile, the ocean breeze turned their outfits into refrigerated sponges. Still, captains insisted the practice was essential, mostly because it conveniently prevented crewmen from moving fast enough to complain. 13. Watching certain Highland villagers survive winter by breathing into ceramic jugs. Is a highlight reel in the Museum of Human Overconfidence. The idea was simple: exhale into a jug, trap the warm air, then inhale it later for instant heat. It was personal climate control, minus the control. Jugs filled with warm breath don't stay warm, nor do they provide oxygen-rich air on repeat. Villagers staggered around puffing into pottery like overworked glassblowers, only to pass out from re-inhaling stale air. But they admired the technique because it felt warm at first, which is the exact standard you should not use for survival. 14. Observing Roman soldiers combat winter by strapping warm bricks to their chests. Shows you what happens when engineering meets desperation. They'd heat clay bricks in a fire, tie them to armor, and march confidently into the cold. The bricks cooled rapidly, leaving them lugging around blocks of disappointment that added weight and no heat. Worse, the bricks occasionally cracked during temperature shifts, sending hot fragments down tunics like vengeful meteors. Officers praised the method as innovative, which in this context meant no one has a better idea, and we're committed to pretending this isn't terrible. 15. Seeing early mountain dwellers prevent frostbite by covering their faces in animal blood because predators don't freeze, is a jaw-dropping level of logic gymnastics. They assumed smearing themselves with the essence of strong animals would transfer cold resistance, as if winter obeyed spiritual licensing agreements. What they actually created was a sticky, rapidly freezing mask that trapped cold against the skin and made them smell like an all-you-can-eat buffet for every carnivore within 5 miles. Predators followed them through snow like fans chasing a food truck. Still, the villagers claimed the ritual connected them to nature, which it did, in exactly the manner nature prefers its meals connected. 16. Watching a medieval mountain clan attempt to outsmart winter by carrying torches around under their cloaks was really the moment humanity announced it would be proceeding through history without adult supervision. They believed walking with a pocket-sized bonfire would trap heat around their bodies, as if they were personally inventing portable central heating, when in reality they were just creating wool-lined ovens with live flame features. Villagers strutted proudly through blizzards with smoke pouring from their cloaks like malfunctioning dragons, insisting the warmth was circulating, right before discovering that the only thing circulating was fresh air rushing in to replace the oxygen being used to set their clothing ablaze. Nothing says winter expertise like calmly converting your outfit into a medieval slow cooker. 17. Watching early hunters deal with freezing temperatures by guys stuffing their mouths with hot stones is the kind of decision that makes you question how humans made it past the Stone Age with any teeth left. The idea was that the boiling stones would warm their breath, which would then warm their bodies, turning them into traveling furnaces, powered entirely by reckless optimism. The stones obviously scorched their tongues, cracked when exposed to saliva, and occasionally exploded like rebellious popcorn kernels. Yet hunters still praise the technique as invigorating, which is clearly just ancient PR for "this hurts, and I'm pretending it doesn't." Meanwhile, the cold continued not caring at all, probably amused that people were voluntarily steaming themselves like dumplings. 18. Seeing a Nordic fishing village battle brutal winters by building giant wooden funnels to catch warm breezes was architectural comedy at its finest. They genuinely believed warm air traveled in roaming pockets across the landscape like lost puppies, waiting to be scooped up by enthusiastic engineers with too much lumber and too little meteorology. The funnels did catch air, unfortunately the freezing, face-slapping kind, and intensified it, turning every home into a wind tunnel that sounded like a screaming choir of angry ghosts. Families sat inside, pretending the design was strategic while holding furniture in place so it wouldn't migrate across the room. An excellent example of people whose problem-solving motto was, well, it can't get colder, right? 19. Watching ancient farmers try to survive a harsh freeze by wrapping their entire bodies in layers of fresh clay reveals a special kind of confidence, the kind that ignores every warning sign provided by common sense. They believed the clay would harden into a protective shell, essentially turning them into human pottery capable of resisting winter's bite. And yes, the clay hardened into a cold, cracking sarcophagus that trapped moisture, froze instantly, and left them waddling around with the mobility of overconfident garden statues. The clay also flaked apart at random moments, giving the impression they were shedding like stressed lizards. But the technique remained popular because people loved saying they were one with the earth, which is poetic code for "I can no longer bend my knees." 20. Witnessing early explorers fend off winter by slathering themselves in honey, was because sticky things hold heat, is the kind of natural selection defiance that makes the cold look merciful by comparison. They coated their skin in thick layers of sugar goo until they resembled baked goods escaping a bakery display, assuming the sweetness would form a thermal barrier. What it formed instead was a traveling insect festival, inviting every wasp, beetle, and opportunistic rodent to join the expedition. The honey also froze, effectively encasing their bodies in frosty caramel armor that cracked every time they tried to move. The explorers insisted they felt sealed and protected, which is a generous interpretation of being refrigerated in dessert glaze. 21. Watching a remote village attempt to beat the cold by digging communal pits and shouting into them to trap heat is a performance piece in the ongoing play titled "Humans Misunderstand Physics." They believed the human voice carried warmth, so if enough people yelled into a pit, the heat would gather at the bottom like obedient little sunbeams. All they accomplished was creating echo chambers that amplified their own shouting back at them, leaving residents convinced the pit was responding with warmth when it was really just announcing their stupidity at double volume. The holes froze over nightly, but villagers chalked that up to insufficient yelling, proving once again that volume is rarely a substitute for logic. 22. Observing medieval soldiers attempt winter survival by binding hot onions to their chests is the kind of innovation only achievable when a culture believes vegetables have emotional loyalty. They assumed onions had inner fire that could be coaxed into radiating warmth, turning every warrior into a walking soup starter. But onions cool rapidly, leaving them with nothing more than damp bulbs strapped under their tunics, emitting aromas that announced their location to enemies from a delightful distance. The technique also invited rats who did not respect battle lines or personal space. Still, commanders swore by it, which really tells you everything you need to know about the medieval hiring process. 23. Watching Highland families greet winter by sleeping with livestock not for heat but for motivation. It was a fascinating display of psychological warfare aimed directly at the cold. They believed that sharing quarters with animals who survived winter with ease would inspire their own bodies to act tougher. What actually happened was predictable. They got stomped on, sneezed on, occasionally mistaken for hay, and permanently aromatized by creatures with very casual relationships to hygiene. The animals stayed warm, the humans stayed delusional, and the cold stayed undefeated. But at least morale improved, mostly because everyone was too tired to argue after spending the night spooning a goat against their will. 24. Seeing ancient villagers stave off freezing nights by placing boiling water in open bowls around their homes as heat generators was a study in optimism, ignoring evaporation. They genuinely believed the water would emit warm air for hours, not realizing steam escapes upward, and warmth dissipates faster than their patience. By morning, the bowls contained ice disks floating in sad, frigid puddles, proof the technique had backfired immediately. Yet villagers defended it passionately, claiming the method kept the spirits alive, which is the kind of metric people switch to when measurable success is no longer available. On the bright side, they unintentionally invented decorative ice sculptures, which really added something to the ambiance of their suffering. 25. Watching mountain herders fight hypothermia by wearing hollowed-out logs as portable shelters. Feels like witnessing humanity speedrun both genius and idiocy simultaneously. The concept was intuitive, block the wind with wood, but the execution produced individuals trudging uphill looking like escaped tree trunks shuffling for freedom. The logs were heavy, inflexible, and impossible to sit in without tipping over, so most herders simply rolled downhill at the first strong gust, turning into unwilling contestants in nature's worst obstacle course. Still, they insisted the logs were dependable companions, which is a surprising level of affection for a garment that regularly threw its wearer into snowbanks. 26. Observing medieval peasants handle freezing temperatures by stuffing burning herbs into their boots, demonstrates that human innovation occasionally forgets which end of the foot should be on fire. They were convinced the smoke and heat from smoldering plants would circulate warmth through their bodies. What circulated instead was panic when the herbs ignited their socks, forcing them to sprint through snow in a dance best described as winter's revenge. But the practice continued because the aroma was considered pleasantly medicinal, which is a charming attitude to have while extinguishing your footwear with frantic kicks. It turns out even bad ideas can smell nice. 27. Watching northern fishermen prevent frostbite by chewing on chunks of frozen fat. To keep the jaws warm is one of history's quieter tragedies. Their reasoning was that constant chewing generated heat, and fat had winter energy that could be absorbed through the mouth. What it actually had was grease that coated their lips, making them more prone to freezing, and a texture so unpleasant it inspired new swear words. But they insisted the technique worked because it kept the mind occupied, which is both true and a very polite way of saying they couldn't think about dying if they were too busy fighting their own gag reflex. 28. Seeing early travelers survive snowstorms by untying ropes around themselves and dragging heavy stones. Behind them is a reminder that not all traditions deserve to survive. The idea was that the stone would steady the walk and prevent them from being blown away by strong winds. The actual effect was watching exhausted travelers drag increasingly large regrets across frozen ground, slowed to the pace of sad glaciers being tugged by overconfident toddlers. The stones often got stuck, causing travelers to face-plant into snowbanks with all the dignity of someone losing a wrestling match to geology. But they continued the practice anyway, possibly because complaining took too much breath. 29. Observing ancient hunters warm themselves by laying across warm animal carcasses, not for insulation, but because they believed the spirit heat stays for hours, is an impressive demonstration of commitment to metaphor. They sprawled across steaming remains like extremely confused royalty, assuming spiritual warmth would seep into their bones. The technique did offer brief physical heat, but also guaranteed that predators would appear, drawn by the scent of a free meal apparently hugging another free meal. Hunters insisted the method taught them respect for nature, though nature's response was typically, "Thank you for the appetizer." 30. Watching early monks brave winter by fasting for days to reduce internal cold is one of the more poetic attempts at self-preservation that absolutely refused to cooperate with biology. They believed digestion created coldness, so if they simply stopped eating, their bodies would glow with warm purity. The result was monks who were spiritually enlightened, physically brittle, and approximately one gust of wind away from blowing over like divine dandelions. They claimed the technique brought them closer to heaven, which might have been true, but only because they were inches from passing out the entire season. 31. Seeing ancient warriors combat freezing temperatures by challenging each other to stay awake for days, a battle of endurance meant to intimidate winter, might be the purest example of confidence defeating common sense. They believed sleep invited cold into the body, so remaining awake would keep them warm, alert, and symbolically defiant. What had actually kept them was delirious, frostbitten, and wandering around camp trying to fight imaginary snow demons. The cold didn't need to defeat them. The sleep deprivation handled that elegantly. But the tradition survived for generations because no one wanted to be the first to admit winter wouldn't be intimidated by a group of shivering men aggressively not napping. Winter clearly wasn't the threat. The real danger was humans auditioning for the world's coldest Darwin Awards. Now go vote for the dumbest one in the comments, and maybe subscribe before the next blizzard of stupidity.